We're looking tonight at this question: how can I find freedom from fear? Just to give you a heads up, like other nights, we're going to have a short time of Q&A at the end. So do go to Pigeonhole at any point and be sticking your questions there and seeing what other people are asking as well. And we'll look at those a little bit later on. It was a cold December morning when a US Navy submarine came to the surface at exactly the same time that a Coast Guard destroyer was in its path. The two vessels collided and the submarine sank to the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean. A search party was sent to try and work out whether there were any survivors still inside the submarine. And as they went down, they heard the sound of tapping coming from the inside of the hull. They discovered it was Morse code. And the message kept repeating itself over and over again, and it was simply this: is there any hope? Is there any hope? And actually, that is a great question to ask, isn't it, as we look at our world that we live in today, as we've heard tonight of the injustice in places like North Korea. Is there any hope? As we stagger out of the aftermath of a global pandemic, is there any hope? As we face an uncertain economic future, is there any hope? As we look at tensions and the possibility, unthinkable as it seems, of war in our continent again, is there any hope? But it's not just out there, is it? But also maybe in our lives more personally, as we think about our circumstances, our future, our fears. Is there any hope for us? Can we know freedom from fear? And actually, we live in a world where there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope, and there does seem to be a lot of fear. In fact, it's interesting that so many of the political debates seem to be driven by fear these days. People on both sides of the political divide on all sorts of issues seem to motivate us by fear of what might happen if we don't. If we do leave Europe, if we don't leave Europe. If we don't lock down, if we do lock down, whatever the debate is, it's often driven by fear. Now, in one sense, perhaps living particularly in the West, there's another factor that feeds that, and it's this. If this world is all there is, if naturalism is the right explanation for the world in which we live, then there isn't ultimately any hope for our world, is there? Yes, we might try and create meaning and significance, but ultimately, in the big scheme of things, there isn't. And someone who was consistent with that worldview was the philosopher Bertrand Russell. And he put it very consistently when he said this: man is the product of causes which had no provision of the end they were achieving. His origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves and beliefs are but the outcome of an accidental collocation of atoms. No fire of heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve the individual life beyond the grave, but all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. And the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Cheerful chap. But actually consistent, because if that is the case, if at the end of the day we're heading towards nothingness, what is the point? I mean, have you ever thought, on a kind of microcosm, if at the end of your 3, 4, 5 years at Cambridge, the university are going to say, well, thanks so much for your money, goodbye. We're not giving you any degree. Would you bother? Would you bother with all the heartache and all the studies if you knew it would count for nothing? But what if that is the ultimate verdict on life? It's pretty depressing, isn't it? But is that the ultimate verdict on life? Is that where we're heading? Or is there something more? Beyond this life, beyond death, beyond this world, is there hope or is there just fear? I was recently in South Africa, and just south of Cape Town where I was, there is the most southwesterly point of the African continent, Cape Point. It's a beautiful place to go and visit. And until about 500 years ago, no one from Europe had been beyond this point. It's a very dangerous part of the sea where two oceans meet, and many had tried, but all had failed to go any further. Until this guy, Bartolomeu Dias from Portugal, sailed down the coast of Africa beyond this point and back from the other side. He was the first man to do it. And because he did it, because he came back safely from the other side, they changed the name of that place to what we now know it as. Not what it was once, the Cape of Storms, but to what it's now called, the Cape of Good Hope. Because someone had come back from the other side and could declare there is hope. There is something on the other side. And in many ways, that is a beautiful illustration of the claim that lies at the heart of the Christian faith. That there is someone who has come back from the other side and says there is hope. There is more. We don't need to fear. The claim of the resurrection of Jesus. On your tables, there's a little segment from one of the letters written by an early Christian to some of the early followers of Jesus. And I just want to read it to us because it talks about this foundation of hope that is at the heart of the Christian faith. Indeed, elsewhere in his writings, the guy who was writing this, a guy called Peter, says that the one thing that should mark a Christian out is that they are marked out by this sense of hope. But he writes this: "Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he's given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that's ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you greatly rejoice, though for now a little while you may have to suffer grief in all kinds of trials." Peter writes to these Christians who are suffering injustice and persecution, who are suffering, and yet he says, you rejoice because you have hope. And that hope is based on, look at it again in verse 3, the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. But you might be saying, why would I want to base my hope on that? Isn't that just a pipe dream, an illusion, a nice religious story? Well, as we thought about at lunchtime, and just want to think for a few moments tonight, what we want to say tonight is this is not just a nice religious story. This is something that actually happened. And if you're willing to investigate it, it's something that you can actually stake your life on. And what may surprise you is even among scholars who reject the Christian faith, there is agreement about certain things that must have happened 2,000 years ago in relation to this claim of resurrection. Let me just go through them briefly, as Niv did earlier on at lunchtime. 5 pieces of evidence. Firstly, that Jesus died. It's not just recorded in the biblical text, but in the extra-biblical text, Jesus' death by crucifixion under the governorship of Pontius Pilate. Secondly, the tomb was empty. No one doubted that for 200 years. And Christianity couldn't have begun, of course, if it hadn't been empty. And an interesting side detail here is that each of the gospel accounts records that the first witnesses of the tomb being empty were women. In first century culture, if you were in a court of law, a woman's testimony would have been thrown out. It wouldn't have been regarded as reliable. Yet why, therefore, would you invent a story and make the biggest witnesses of the greatest events the people who wouldn't have been believed in your situation? The tomb was empty. Number 3, the disciples were convinced that they had met the risen Jesus. Something happened to convince them that they had encountered him again alive after his death. So much so that they were willing to go to their deaths on this claim. Number 4, the lives of Jesus' followers were transformed by this belief in the resurrection. Not just those who had previously followed him, a kind of case of confirmation bias, but even those who were skeptical about him during his lifetime, like his own half-brother James, who then became a convinced Christian, a leader of the Jerusalem church. Or someone like Saul of Tarsus, a vowed opponent of the Christian faith until he encounters the risen Jesus and then starts preaching and proclaiming the message he had once rejected. And then number 5, this explosive growth of the Christian church within these first few decades of these events, all based on this idea that Jesus was alive. In fact, it was so explosive and so rapid that Tacitus is able to say that Nero was able to fasten the guilt of the fire of Rome upon the Christian community in that city because they were so numerous. Not that they were guilty, but he was able to do that because it spread. Now, the question we need to ask is this. If that is what happened, how do we explain what happened? Actually, interestingly, over the last 200 years particularly, as people have objected this to scrutiny, only certain alternative explanations have been put forwards. If you can think of a better one, stick it on the pigeonhole later on. But how do we explain it? Well, some people say this. We can explain it away by saying that someone else died on the cross. That's often the claim that's made by many of my Muslim friends. Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. It was someone else. I guess the question I want to raise there is, where does that idea come from? It certainly doesn't come from any of the contemporary witnesses. In fact, the first time this is suggested is several centuries after the claim, after the events. No one at the time made that claim, and Jesus was a prominent figure who would have been well known, and people wanted to make sure he was well dead. Some people say, well, maybe Jesus didn't actually die. He kind of passed out on the cross. He revived in the tomb. People mistook that for resurrection when it was really a kind of case of resuscitation. Now, bearing in mind that crucifixion was pretty brutal and there was no record of anyone ever surviving it, even the one time when someone was taken off the cross while they were still alive, they still died from their wounds later. But let's just kind of imagine somehow this happened, that Jesus wasn't really dead, and he was taken off the cross and he was put in the tomb. At some point over the next 3 days, what would have happened was that Jesus would have to kind of revive, and then he would find himself wrapped in yards and yards of burial cloth. So he would kind of have to unravel himself rapidly and then wrap it all up again and put it on the side. And then he would have to push this large stone away from the entrance to the tomb, beat it past a whole legion of Roman guards, wash off the blood in a nearby river, find some clothes from a passerby, appear in a room that was locked to his scared disciples, and then convince them that he was the Lord of history, that had conquered death and not a desperately sick man in need of urgent medical care. In other words, that's very hard to imagine happening, isn't it? Let's go for number three. Number three, some people say, well, the women went to the wrong tomb. Actually, I did have someone once say, well, they are women and they're bad at directions, which I would not say because the blokes would have gone to the wrong tomb as well. And actually, my wife's far better at directions than me. But let's imagine that they did, okay? Let's imagine that all the disciples repeatedly on every occasion kept going to the wrong tomb. By the way, you don't often forget where you bury someone if you've had to do that. But let's imagine they did. A few weeks later, one of these disciples, Peter, stands up in the same city and starts declaring to the thousands of people present that Jesus isn't dead, but he's alive and his tomb is empty. Can you imagine what would have happened? Some guy at the back of the crowd would have stood up and said, Peter, I think you guys went to the wrong tomb, you idiots. Jesus' tomb's down that road. That's Uncle John's tomb. They took his body away weeks ago. Everyone would have had a good laugh, the Christians would have looked very stupid, and the whole thing would have died a death very quickly. What about this? Number 4. Maybe the body was moved. Well, of course, you have to ask who would have moved it. Grave robbers? Well, grave robbing can happen, but why would they want to rob the tomb of a penniless preacher, leave the only thing of value behind, the grave clothes, at great risk to their own lives? The authorities, well, they had the possibility of doing that. They would have had access to the body if they wanted it, but why would they want to move it? And if they had, why didn't they produce it when the story of resurrection started being trumpeted from the streets of Jerusalem? Or was it the disciples? Well, firstly, they didn't seem to be expecting the resurrection. But also, if they had moved the body, then of course, when they started proclaiming the resurrection and discovered that this didn't lead to wealth, money, and power, but actually ostracization, persecution, and death, you might think someone would have spoken up and said, oh, actually, it's not quite the way we thought it was. People make up stories to get themselves out of trouble, don't they? I used to do that all the time, actually, when I was a kid. I used to say things like, the dog ate it, or my sister did it, or it was on fire when I arrived, those kind of things. And they were stories to get myself out of trouble, but I never made up a story to get myself into trouble, because that's not what we do. Why would these disciples make up this story and then stand by it, when actually it was at great, great cost? People may die for things that they think are true, but are not, but no one dies for things that they know aren't true. What about this? Maybe the disciples were hallucinating. Maybe they just thought they had encountered the risen Jesus, but it was a hallucination. And sometimes hallucinations, of course, can occur. I was talking to a friend, Glyn Harrison, recently. He was professor of psychiatry at Bristol. And he said the thing about hallucinations is that they have certain marks. They normally happen to individuals, not to whole groups of people. They normally happen at the periphery of our vision, a face in a crowd, a voice in a hubbub. But these things were different. They happened to whole groups of people all at once. They were at the center of their vision. They met Jesus, they touched him, they talked to him, they ate with him. And instead of having a negative effect on their mental well-being, it had the opposite. It turned them into bold witnesses who would take on the Roman authorities and change that world within a couple of decades. Hallucinations don't explain that. And nor, by the way, would they still explain away the problem of the empty tomb, which you've got to hold on to. So what about this? Maybe Jesus actually rose from the dead. As crazy as that seems to our minds when we first think about it, given what we know about history, it is actually, I would suggest, the only explanation that makes sense of it. Now, you might be saying, well, hang on a minute. I am an intelligent person. I got into Cambridge, for goodness sake. I cannot believe that kind of stuff. I just can't believe it. I'm a 21st century materialist. I know that miracles can't happen. As obvious as that seems, given the evidence, I still can't believe it. Can I just say this? Although the disciples in the first century obviously didn't go to Cambridge, they knew as well as the rest of the world knows that dead people stay dead. But also, the idea of resurrection would have seemed as crazy to them as it would to us, but just for different reasons. For a first century Jew to believe that God would become a human being, live on planet Earth, die at the hands of their enemies on a Roman cross, be buried, and then 3 days later, in the middle of history, rise from the dead, was no more part of their expectation of what is likely or possible as it is for us. In fact, we know that because 3 times in this Uncover book, Jesus predicts his death and resurrection. He says it quite clearly. I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die, 3 days later I'm going to rise again. What do we find 3 days after Jesus' crucifixion? The disciples having a little planning meeting to decide when they should go and check out whether the resurrection's happened? No. The women are going to anoint what they think is a dead body. The blokes are probably, still in bed, doing what blokes do. But no one is expecting the resurrection because it wasn't part of their sense of what could be possible. What I'm saying is this: they didn't come to the conclusion that Jesus was alive because it was neat. It fitted with their worldview. It isn't. It doesn't neatly fit with any worldview. It blows all of our worldviews apart. But they came to believe it because they were convinced it was true. And I guess I want to say this. Don't come to believe the resurrection because it's easy, because it fits. It blows everything apart. I was chatting to a guy last week ago exactly, in Warwick. He said to me, gosh, I think Jesus might have risen from the dead. This changes everything. I said, you're absolutely right there. It does. But what if it is true? Well, you might say as we close, what difference does it make? And it makes all the difference in the world. We've been thinking about fear. And if Jesus rose from the dead, we have freedom from fear. Fear, firstly, about our past. Because actually, we all have a past, don't we? We've thought about it this week. We may live in a society where we're fearful, particularly of unveiling the mistakes of our past. We don't want them to be seen. But actually, the Bible says there's a God that sees it all. But wonderfully, because Jesus rose from the dead, we can be freed from the fear of that. And freed from the fear of the consequences of that. Because when Jesus died on the cross, he died to deal with the guilt and the shame that we should all carry. And when he rose from the dead, he rose to show that that payment that he had made as he died on the cross was accepted, was enough, that it was finished. We don't need to carry around the guilt or the fear or the shame. Jesus rose from the dead. It's dealt with. It can be done. But also, if Jesus rose from the dead, we don't just have the fear of the past that's dealt with, it's the fear of the future as well. Jesus says, I have gone through death, and death has nothing to fear for those who know me. Before I went to Edinburgh to study, I remember working for a summer just outside Leicester, where I was living at the time. And there was a guy who I worked with who was a bit older than me, he was married, had kids. And when I went away to college, I heard that his wife had been diagnosed with cancer. She had treatment, but sadly it was ineffective, and eventually she was given just a few months to live. She died a few weeks later, and no one who went to her funeral will ever forget what happened. It was in a small village chapel where they lived. It was packed. There was Barry, his children, extended family. And they brought in Paula's coffin into the building. And as they did, they played a song over the loudspeaker system. And it was a song that was familiar to some who were regulars at the church. But everyone sat up and listened because the person who was singing this song was Paula, the lady who was now in the coffin. In fact, she had sung it just a few weeks before and requested that it be played at that particular moment. And the last verse of that hymn that she was singing says this: "No guilt in life, no fear in death. This is the power of Christ in me. From life's first cry to final breath, Jesus commands my destiny. No power of hell, no scheme of man could ever pluck me from his hand. Till he returns or calls me home, here in the power of Christ I'll stand." And she could sing that because she knew that Jesus was alive. She didn't need to fear. Death was not the end. Death is not a full stop, just a comma, just a gateway, a doorway, and actually a doorway into a dimension of life that's even fuller and more wonderful. But you say, what difference does it make today? Well, it makes all the difference for today too. Because if death is not the end, then life now matters with a greater degree of significance. All of life does. And we can be motivated to work in this world to make it a better place, to campaign for justice and freedom, because we know that ultimately the trajectory of history is to a day of ultimate justice and ultimate freedom. Think of Martin Luther King. How did he inspire people to fight against the evils of racism? By painting a picture of fear? No. By proclaiming a vision of hope. A day when one day all God's people, of whatever race and color, are brought together in unity. It was the hope that he had as a Christian that drove him to make a difference in this world now. And when you have that hope, it doesn't mean you bury your head in the sand and think, oh, it doesn't matter. Everything matters. And we want to make a difference. So I guess my question is, do you know that freedom and that hope tonight? And if you don't, what's stopping you from discovering it? In the last book of the Bible, there are some words that the risen Jesus is recorded as speaking. I just want to read them to you. They come on the screen. He says this: I stand at the door, he says, and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me. Jesus is saying these words, in a sense, also to us. And he's saying he's standing at the door, not the physical door, but the metaphorical door of our lives. He's on the outside because we put him there. We've tried to live without him. But he says, I knock because I want to come on the inside to be in your life. And there's a beautiful picture there. I want to eat with them and they with me. This picture of friendship. That's what God wants with us. My question tonight is, where is Jesus? Is he on the outside? And if so, what's stopping you from, as it were, opening the door and saying, come on the inside? What are the bolts, you might say, that are keeping that door shut? And I guess one of the bolts might be doubt. Maybe you're saying, well, I've come along this week and I've found it really interesting, but I'm not 100% sure. That's okay. By the way, in life, there are very few things that we're 100% sure about outside of maths. So if we're looking for that kind of level of certainty, we're not going to do much, are we? But also, maybe you think of the Christian faith being a bit like this. Maybe you think of it as a kind of leap of faith. You ever think of that? It's just, I just need to close my eyes and just summon up some supernatural ability to believe something. But can I suggest it's not that? Think of what we've been looking at over the talks of this week. Think about the evidence for God that we've thought about. Think about the reliability we've talked about of the gospel accounts of Jesus' life. Think about the evidence for Jesus. Think about the way that Christianity makes emotional sense. Think about the resurrection that we've thought about tonight and the evidence for that. Think about the way it's made a difference in people's lives, as we've heard about not just tonight, but through this week, not just from people from North Korea, but also people here in Cambridge. And when you think about all of that together, it's not a leap of faith, is it? It's a step of faith. Still faith, but there's good reasons for taking it. And maybe for some tonight, actually, it would be a bigger leap to now reject everything, given what you've looked at and now what you know, than it would be to accept it. That would be a more sensible thing to do, perhaps. Maybe, though, it's not doubt that's keeping the door shut. Maybe it's fear. Fear of, how your life will change. And the reality is, if you get on board with Jesus and ask him to come into your life, it will change your life. And it won't always be easy. And as we've heard tonight, for many people in the world, it will be very difficult. But it is worth it. If it's trusting someone who loved you enough to die for you and is alive to be with you through life, worth it. Maybe it's the worry about what other people will think. And for some of us, that's just the fear of maybe a bit of, social mockery. And I just want to say, if that's the case for you, look, if this is true, don't be a wuss. It's worth following. Go with it. Have the courage to go with it, even if it might be hard. For some, though, tonight, maybe it's much bigger than that. The choice to follow Jesus could have big consequences. And for some, in other parts of the world, it has seriously big consequences. But Jesus says two things into that. You could read them in this Uncover book in chapters 8 and chapters 10. He says this: there is a cost to following me, but the cost of not following me ultimately is bigger. And the best blessings, the benefits of following me will outweigh any cost. It is worth it. So what's stopping you from opening that door? Look, some of you might be here for the first time tonight and going like, whoa, I've got lots of questions, and that's fine. We're just so happy you're here. But some of you, you've been coming, and actually you think, I think this could be true. And I just want to finish tonight just with a short prayer for anyone who wants to do that, to say to this God who loves you in Jesus, I want you to come into my life. Give me this hope, this freedom, this forgiveness that we've heard about this week. And if that's you, then as I pray, not a magic formula or anything like that, but just a way of expressing what you want to do, then maybe this would be helpful to echo silently in your heart. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. Just listen. But if you do, maybe this would be a helpful way to respond. So let's just have a moment of quiet. You can close your eyes if you want. Just a few seconds to reflect, and then I'll pray. And if you'd like to pray too, then just silently, maybe these words would be helpful for you. God, I'm sorry for the way that I've kept you out of my life, for the things that I've done that have hurt you and hurt others. Thank you that Jesus died and rose again for me so that I could have forgiveness and a new life with you. Please come into my life now. Give me this hope that you've talked about in the future. Bring me this freedom and this forgiveness that you offer through Jesus. And help me to live with you at the center from now on. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.